Let's add these 3D printed notches to this 2-part plaster mold here so we can slip cast forms like this. Recently I made this plaster mold using some 3D prints. In particular these here. It has an inner mold, has a bottom base plate, and has some outer mold walls. These get assembled together. We add some binder clips to secure everything, mix up plaster, pour the plaster, and once it's set, we get these two pieces here. To slip cast a pot, basically these get stacked on top of each other. They get aligned, we go ahead and rubber band it together, pour in the slip. Once the slip sets, we can then demold our pot. Getting something just like this. This mold here has two flat faces where the molds come together. There are no mold notches or mold keys to align pieces, so you have to do so manually. In practice, this hasn't really been a problem for me, but recently I've been exploring these 3D printed mold notches. So in this video, I want to go ahead and remake this plaster and incorporate these into it. We can then compare this original mold to the new one using the notches. So this is inspired by Tony from Digital Fire and his 3D printed notch system. It comes in several pieces. So there's the male notch itself. There is a female version, which he calls a spacer, and these two are what slide together to provide the alignment. These are held inside of these pieces here, which he calls embeds. Basically, they slide down once the mold's been made. And he has a couple of other pieces that are used as tools. These slide into the embeds like that and are used when we're pouring the plaster. So that's the mold notch system. In my last video, I went ahead and did that for handles. I removed the features that come in shape cast for lining the molds that produce pieces inside the plaster for registration. So I modified the shape cast handle molds by putting a hole in it so we could slide in the clips. That let us then pour plaster with the embeds in place. I could then insert the final pieces for the notch system. That lets us assemble the mold, press it together, rubber band it up, pour slip, and get out handles like this. These are untrimmed. I just went ahead and let them go bone dry, but were my tests from the last video. This one here was to test the alignment, which looks pretty good. And then I lapped the face of the plaster and got this piece out. From what I found so far, I think the lapping of the surface is a good feature. Since these pieces are pressed in later, you can actually sand this flat. The 3D prints are usually pretty good, but sometimes they have some slight imperfections. So by sanding it against a flat surface, we can really dial in this face. So the mold halves really seat well together. The other thing that having separate pieces does is lets us dial in tolerances. Again, the 3D prints aren't perfect, and to get the pieces to fit together, you actually need to slightly adjust the sizes of these things. So I did that for my printer and my filament and my print settings, and found some settings that worked for me. But that lets us decouple the fit issues for the notches from the base 3D print itself. Not too sure exactly how to generalize this, but it does let us dial in those tolerances. So to make this change, I did have to go into CAD and play around with the models themselves. So basically I had to remove these features and put in the holes. Then I made several changes to the notch system itself so it worked with these models. In particular, I made the clips bigger and more beefy so they're not likely to break, and they account for the thickness of my 3D prints for my molds. So taking this idea and putting it into the vessel should be relatively straightforward. The only change we really need to make is to put holes in this base plate here. Since these two pieces come together, these represent the mold faces, these pieces right here. And so if we have holes in corresponding spots, that will then let us put in the mold system. The rest of the pieces, the inners and the outer walls, I'm going to reuse. These, however, won't be needed in this video. Instead, we need these. I went ahead and decided to put 4 holes in, so we'll have 4 mold keys, 4 notches in our plaster mold. I think this is kind of an arbitrary number, but since Shapecast provides halves and quadrants, I figured 4 was a nice number. And obviously we can't pour plaster with the holes in the bottom, so we need to go ahead and insert the notches. So first we need a clip, and again these are the ones I modified so that they're thicker to account for the thickness of my 3D prints. Those just press through. For me they're relatively tight, and I've noticed some variance in playing around with these, that some of them are tighter and some of them are looser. And then next we take an embed and slide it over the top just like that. We'll do that 4 times, and we'll put in the inner mold. However, I ran into a problem doing this. I placed these holes basically equidistant between the ridges in the base plate here. However, if we look at this, we have very little clearance between the embed and our 3D print. So that means there's going to be, I don't know, less than a millimeter of plaster between the embed and the 3D print. And I worry about that being brittle. So my first idea was to go ahead and push these holes farther out. However, when I jumped into CAD, I went ahead and pulled in the outer mold as well, and we only have a millimeter of space from the outer mold and the embed as well. Towards the top we have a little bit more, but where it curves down to make a nice rounded surface, in particular this edge here, we start to run into clearance issues as well. So I don't think this will work as is. And shifting it around doesn't seem to be a real answer. So what are the options? One is I could shrink this down. However, that means that the notch itself gets smaller. And I don't know that that's a good answer. They're already not too big. The other option is I could modify the geometry. However, this is really baked into Shapecast and is actually rather complicated. So I didn't want to do that. But if I was able to make some more space here, we'd have more space in the plaster. Basically, this wall here would get thicker. But I think that really is a last resort just because the code is rather complicated. If you're modeling these up from scratch, I think it's probably less of a big deal and you could just take that into consideration. But I'm not too sure if I'll like these or if I'm going to go forward with them, so I wanted to make a test as simple as possible. So we need to get rid of this piece, and what I decided to do instead is just slice off the edge of the embed in the slicer. So I just loaded this up, picked a point, that seemed reasonable. We have a wall that goes all the way around, but now I can orient this, have the flat side towards the inner mold, and we have a tiny bit more clearance. It's still not a lot, but it's more than what we had before. I'm not too sure this is the long-term solution, but I think for now it should be good enough to let us try this out and see how it goes. So I have a bunch of pieces. Let's go ahead and start putting things together. All the clips go in, and some of those are kind of tight. Next, we'll have all the modified embeds. These will slide down over the top, and these actually feel a little bit loose, even though the tolerances are exactly the same as last time. Don't worry about these shifting and floating away. But that's all part of the test. All right, and the idea is that these will get captured in the plaster, and then they will release. We'll be able to pull off the ring as well as the clip and leave the embed embedded in the surface of the plaster. So for the rest of the mold, it basically will assemble like a normal Shapecast mold. Take the inner, place it on, use binder clips to secure it, and then add the outer as well. And the rest of these pieces we need once the plaster is cured. So let's see if these stay put. I'm not sure. The answer is no. It's not a good omen for being plaster tight. Now we can put it back on. Yeah, these tolerances seem a little loose, even though they're exactly the same as my last print that I used for my handles. All right, next the outer mold. And normally I do this upside down, but I'm worried about those embeds shifting around. There's the bottom half, so we'll do the top. And you can see the embeds hiding out down in there. They look like they haven't shifted too much. Let me go ahead and get reset for plaster. So I'll go ahead and measure everything out. I'll get all the numbers that came from Shapecast, and we'll mix the plaster, pour it, and then once that's done, we'll go ahead and demold. Now, if things go wrong, this is where they go wrong. Let's hope they don't leak out the bottom. I don't want to displace the embeds either. All right, so far so good. No plaster disasters, we'll call that a win. Successful pour. I'll go ahead and let this set, clean up my tools, then we'll be back. No plaster disasters, but I do see a little bit of plaster down in here. Just a tiny bit. So I'm guessing that the embed wasn't fully seated. Or it could be the plaster leaked around the tolerance. That was pretty loose. Normally the bottom ring here just pops off, but now we have these clips protruding into the embed, so it might be a little bit more tricky. For the handles, I just pry it up gently. Yep, and that's working. So there's our first look. Those seem like they're pretty flush. And the outer mold releases. You had a little bit of plaster leak around the clip and down into the embed, but just a little bit. That comes off nice and clean as well. Let's do a little bit of cleanup. So we did get a little bit of flash over the inner mold, which means that the inner mold and the ring are at slightly different levels, and I think this is where lapping will come into place, where we can get it down nice and flush. Just make sure it's not in our way. All right, there we go. So now we can demold these like any other shape cast mold. Oops, a little too much. So this is frozen isopropyl alcohol and water. And the idea is that isopropyl alcohol stays cold. Here we go. As I was saying, the idea is that the isopropyl alcohol stays liquid at freezer temperatures, and this shrinks the 3D print just a little bit. Makes demolding much easier. We have our two molds. You can see that the embed is below the surface of the plaster. This happened with our last one as well, so they seem to move just a little bit. And my strategy of cutting off the sides seemed to be okay. They aren't perfectly aligned, but we've got a little bit of space between the 3D print and the face of the plaster. Hopefully that's enough to hold up. And the other one's very similar. These will dry out, and then we can test out the notches. Now that the molds are dry, we can go ahead and finish with the notch system. We have 4 pairs, so we'll need 4 notches and 4 spacers. So we can go ahead and insert these. And I think I'm going to make it non-symmetric, so it can only go in one way. So 3 male and 1 female, so that means this one will need to be male. and the rest female. It's really interesting. It's definitely inconsistent in terms of how tight they are. So now this will go together, just like that. And I don't feel a lot of play. That means we can go ahead and test this. And I want to do a side-by-side comparison with the previous one I did with no notches at all. Go ahead and secure these together with rubber bands. So for one with notches, all we really need to do is make sure that it's held together. For this one, we also have to deal with the alignment. And for that, I can both feel the outside where we had the outer molds. And I can also look down inside and feel. See down, looks pretty well aligned. And this one, we don't have any adjustment with the mold notches, so hopefully it's good too. I just mixed my slip up, so we can go ahead and cast a pot. This is the one with notches. And our original. I'll let these hang out and let the slip finish dripping out and let the pot start to firm up. Time to demold. Let's start with the new one. Need to trim off the excess clay. And let's see how it releases. And it's loose, but pulling it apart, there we go. No problem. All right, the bottom's still stuck. I'm gonna give it another minute. I don't want to deform it too much. We shift our attention to the previous one. This is basically our baseline for comparison. And sample sizes of 1 are never great, but better than nothing. And this one release, but from the bottom. There we go. So we got a little bit of flash here on the mold. And our original, there's our seam line, and without cleaning it up, it's a little bit hard to tell the misalignment. All right, let's try this one again. Yeah, okay. So looking at the molds, we definitely have less flash. There's a little bit here, that's it. So it might be that the mold keys held things together better. And here is the pot straight out of the mold. Definitely a better seam line. and aligned pretty well still. So that's looking pretty good. While I'm testing things out, I want to do the same thing I did with the handles, and that is I want to go ahead and lap these surfaces. Basically, I want to sand these flat. I'll use my bench as a flat surface and just take off a little bit so that these faces mate together better. And we can do this with the notch system because these parts are removable. So I'll pop these out and do that. And the idea is that we should be able to minimize the flash between the pieces. And since we have a little bit of difference between these, I'm curious how much of it's the notches and how much of it is just a variation in the surface itself from using the 3D prints. And these two back here, I'm not going to go and do any cleanup on them. I want to basically use them as reference for what comes straight out of the molds. So to lap the surface of this one, we need to pull the notches back out. Some of them are more loose than others. There we go, I got 3. There we go. All the spacers can stay in since they're below the surface. What I want to do is clean off my bench. And then I have this here, it's a sheet of 220 sandpaper. It's actually the one I use for the handles. I'll put some water down and we'll basically sand in circles to try and evenly take down this surface. And it might be hard to make out, but you can see the faint hints of some layer lines that are left. Basically, I'm going to take those down. Put some water on here. Take our mold. And then something like that, I don't see the layer lines anymore. Same thing for this one. All right, that's looking smooth all the way around. And the idea is that these should mate together better now. We shouldn't have any gaps that were induced by the 3D prints themselves. Get any plaster paste off. And then we can put the notches back in. And slide things together. I'll do the same thing for this one. Wipe off that little bit of clay we have. There we go. All right, these are a little bit wet already, so my casting times will be off, but I think for determining how well the seam works, I think we'll be okay to go ahead and do a back-to-back. Let's go ahead and put them back together then. All right, same drill. We'll be back when it's time to demold. Just as before, let's start with the one with the notches. Perfect. And the bottom of this mold holding on a little bit more, so we'll give it a second. And then the one without the mold keys, but we just lapped. So first impressions, we definitely cleaned up the flash that was happening. All right, these are still a little bit damp, I think, from casting back to back. So I'm going to give it a few more minutes, let them dry a little bit more, and shrink and release from the plaster. That way we don't mess up our test. All right, let's try that one more time. Oh yeah. No problem. Those are looking good. So here is the lapped one. There's a little bit of a seam line. I think some of this is actually in the 3D print itself. So we have a little bit more of a seam line here. So it could be that we just need to sand a little bit more to get it down more flush, but it's very similar. So we can compare the ones with just the mold keys and the mold keys with lapping. So this is where we started with just manually aligning things. And I don't see really much in terms of a layer shift. I got that pretty well aligned. It didn't take too much effort. And then the one we just did, have a little bit more flash. And again, I don't see much in terms of a layer shift. So maybe that's just my skill and I can do these pretty well. However, I really also think it comes down to the molds. Since we use the outer molds, it means aligning them. We can do that from the outside by feel. I do think lapping helped, and it might be worth lapping a little bit more on this one and seeing where we get. So here's one with notches, and again, we got a little bit of a seam here, not too much. The alignment looks good as well. And lapping did seem to help a little bit more, and we got really minimal seam line here. And going back to these just for a second, it might be hard to tell, but I actually see a little bit of a recess here, so I think the flash we're getting is I just didn't sand enough. Not too sure why that happened with this particular mold, but it has nothing to do with the keys themselves. There's just a little bit of a divot there. And I can see it here too. It just slightly beveled in. So I think the residual flash that we're seeing on this one is exactly that. It's the mold itself, and I just need to sand it a little bit more. I definitely think lapping the molds is a good idea, dialing in this face so they seat better. And we can do that without the mold keys, or with this notch system. Before you put in the notches themselves, it's also possible to sand. Or if they're loose enough, you can pull them back out like I did. In terms of the side-to-side alignment, I'm not so sure. I could see if you're doing production work, it is less fiddly. You can basically just drop it down and it's right in place. If you are making fewer pots, then you can align them manually like I did, and your results I think are still pretty good. I think the primary challenge with these, and it comes back to the handles as well, is that the tolerance needed to get these parts to fit well is a bit tricky. The early test I did, I used Tony's original clearances and they were way too loose. I think just aligning them manually would be better. They basically were just a loose alignment, similar to how my handles are right now. So in terms of me thinking about this with Shapecast, my goal with Shapecast and the design system was to eliminate the need to do CAD. And by having this tolerance built in, basically you would need to be able to 3D print and tune the notches to your specific printer. Once you have that tuning, then it would need to be some sort of parameter that gets put into the model, and that just makes things much more complicated, both on the software end for me, but also on your end in figuring out how your printer works. So I do think it's a win, but I'm not too sure about it being in the custom molds themselves. I also think there might be some other options besides putting the notches into the molds themselves. This is really mimicking traditional plaster notches, and since we have a 3D printer, that actually opens the door to do many other things. So for instance, we could have some structures on the outside that help with alignment. That could be purely 3D printed. They don't need to be plaster as well. I've thought about a couple different options there. I might try that out, but if so, that would be a future video. And just for one last fun comparison, can you tell which one is which? Let me know down in the comments if you can figure it out, and if someone gets it right, I'll let them know. Go ahead and order them from your right to your left. 1, 2, 3, 4. Which one's which? Overall, I think that was a useful test. However, I was expecting something a little bit more conclusive. I figured I'd either like them and they would work awesome, or I wouldn't like them and it was a clear thing to go ahead and pass up. And right now I'm feeling somewhat in the middle. They're both a little bit more work, but they are a little bit more help. There's also this open issue that we're gonna have to resolve. While lopping off the side did give me enough clearance, just by a bit, I'm not sure this is a great long-term solution. Basically, you have to get them oriented, and with the tolerances being loose, like that, by the time you assemble the mold, those are way down in there, and if they shifted around a little bit, you'd have to disassemble the mold. The other problem with loose tolerances is that in assembling the mold, it really is convenient to turn it upside down, and if they fall off, that doesn't really do much good. And there's enough inconsistency here that I'm still not sure exactly what to do. Some of them are really loose, have others that go on and they stick just fine. And these are all printed at exactly the same time on the same printer. Maybe my expectations in terms of tolerances are just a little too high. I think for this to be a good system to use, it would probably need to be a little bit better, and I'm not sure exactly how to do that right now. That tolerance issue should appear too. Some of these really slide in and out easily, others are basically stuck in there. And I think them being stuck is good, but them sliding around means that we have a little bit of play here that I don't think we want. It's a few days later and I couldn't help but do one more test. I went and lapped the surface of my original mold a little bit more, since I think some of the seam I was getting was from that still. And this is what we have now. And I think I can see a little bit more of the shift now. I think it is really small, but it is there. I think before with the larger seam, it was a little bit harder to tell. So that was definitely a useful test. I think lapping does get you most of the way, but having slightly better alignment would also be useful, if we can figure out these other problems. If you have any questions or comments, let me know. Thanks.